Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Toke. Thank you, Maren. Thank you to the Keynes Fund for having us and for funding us, even more important. So today we're going to talk about a paper that will come out of a project funded by the Keynes Fund, looking at lighthouses and especially safety at sea. So this is one aspect of the project we're going to talk about today. And this is a project that is with three colleagues, at least that are in, well, two of colleagues that are in the room and one probably still asleep in the US. So Lee Shaw-Taylor, Oliver Dunn, and Dan Bogart probably will watch this online later. So what do we want to do with this? Well, obviously, I just want to advertise what I'm going to do today is show you really lots of data. I will tell you really with what we're working on. So it's a bit data heavy. And also I'll advertise immediately what we want to do. First, we found that lighthouses did or seem to have increased safety at sea. And the second thing is that determining exactly how much and how econometrically is not something we found particularly easy. So you'll see that at the end, the conclusions are quite tentative and certainly require more modeling that we would be very happy to have your feedback on. So what is it that we wanted to do with this? Well, there's a first sort of obvious thing is that lighthouses are a form of public good. And innovation in public good is a fundamentally important element and driver of human welfare throughout history. And we wanted to understand with lighthouses how or what were the mechanisms of the delivery of that public good, and whether we could, in a historical context, measure the impact of those public goods, both for obviously the people who were sailing around the UK, but obviously the people then enjoyed the goods that were delivered on time and therefore with fewer loss and therefore increased productivity. Well, the first thing to say is that the lighthouse itself as an object has become a sort of a totem or some sort of a key element in at least the literature about public good. This obviously comes from an article written by Keynes in 1974 about lighthouses themselves. And this has really led to the lighthouse becoming that sort of a totemic or beacon of a certain view of the provision of public good by the market rather than the state. You could see that the Independent Institute even used the lighthouse as their icon and really makes this sort of claim. The lighthouse is a symbol of courage, enlightenment, and independence. Well, since then, and since Keynes, obviously, quite a few people have been looking at lighthouses in a historical context or from historians, but also from economists. And Dan, Oliver, Lee, and Eduardo Alvarez have also sort of tried to put this in a much broader and much more sort of empirically based context, to try to understand what was happening with lighthouses in Britain. And so the article has just been published this year. So this is was the first contribution. And what we're going to do today is try to move from, if you want, the iconic version, so rather ahistorical, but very heavy on theory or even ideology, to, in that case, it's Headstone here, properly inform, rigorously testable data that will try to understand what's happening. The second strand of the literature we're also addressing is really the effect of lighthouses and improvement as a driver of marine safety. There's a recent paper by Morgan Kelly, Cormac O'Grada, Peter Soller on precisely that aspect and the role of marine safety in the decrease of insurance costs and therefore ultimately in the increase of shipping productivity. In this article, they show using marine insurance rate that there was a real decline or real improvement in safety in the 19th century, and they looked at quite a few factors, but they didn't look at lighthouses, or they just mentioned it briefly. Whereas we found, and we know that over this period, there are significant innovations. There are massive upgrades in terms of the ranges, in terms of the quality of the lighthouse, and many lighthouses were built. So we wanted to see what was happening there. And so the key question that we had for this paper is, did lighthouses contribute to increasing shipping productivity? And there are two aspects of this: reducing the journey time. So if it's faster, it then boats can deliver more things, or by reducing the amount of ships that were lost. In this paper today, I'm going only to focus on loss at sea because of time. So what are the data? I said I would be quite data heavy, so here we go. The first thing we want, obviously, is to know about the lights. I mean, if we're going to study lighthouses. There was a good starting point for this. So in the previous Keynes Fund funded project, Oliver, Edward, Lee, and Dan had already created a data set of lights for England and Wales. So over just 500 lights that they are geolocated for Britain, for the England and Wales. We now expanded this data set to cover the entire of the UK. And so we have over 1,400 lights. Then also we increased the temporal depth of the data set by transcribing the Admiralty list. So we have snapshots every 10 years. And so we then can interpolate and create annual series. And we have many more characteristics. So we have the height of the sea, obviously that's very important to know what would be the range. We'll have all the built and the alteration dates. We have the type of optics that they use. We have the kind of lighting equipment. We have the type of fuel. We have sometimes the angle that is visible, etc. And these are the series we use for the lights. So this is what the data in its original form that helps us to build the data set. If you think about what it looks like then on a map, so this is the old data set and this is the new data set in its maximum expansion. So each one of these is obviously a light that we have in our data set. Then we have created some code that allows us to take those information on angles this to also display accurately the exact angle or the range that is lit for each portion of the sea. Now, if we have lights, that's great. But if you want to know something about safety at sea, it would be great to know what happens when it doesn't go well. In that case, we use wrecks. So we have three sources of data that we use to study wrecks. The first one is 6 volumes of publication, mostly coming from Lloyd's, but complemented by extract from newspapers and even diving excursions by Bridget and Richard Larn over many years. And that, by extracting the relevant information for us, is over 31,000 wrecks around the British Isles that we have all geolocated with the information on what the cargo was, where the ship was bound to, obviously where it wrecked, and where it originated from. We also scraped sort of data from Wikipedia on wrecks, and we tag those, so it geotags, so obviously it is less precise than the one you would get by having a marine observation, but we also have some information on the type of what the vessel was, what type, and where it was going to. Finally, we have data, which is sometimes archaeological, sometimes we don't know exactly the source, but it was provided by the French, the Irish, and the British Hydrographic Offices. But these are really points on a map. So if we think about the advantage of each data set, we use them for different types. An archaeological data set is extremely precise in terms of location, tells you very little in terms of context. The Wikipedia one, well, sometimes good for data and some for information, very bad for location, and the LAN is very good for the information and quite good for the location. If we look at points on a map, this is what it looks like. So each one of those points is a ship that is wrecked and that is in our data set. Then what we did is we aggregated all that data into a hex grid that we built for this project. So then we can, obviously aggregate them by decade, by year, by whatever we want. These are the units we're working with. Then when we do this, we can start to analyze the data of the wrecks themselves. And what we noticed is that there was already, by looking at the our entire series, a real change in the seasonality of wrecking. So if you could see here, all the light lines are the late period, and the darker the line, the earlier the period. And you can see that there's a flattening of the line over time, which means that you are more likely to wreck in the summer month and less likely to wreck in the winter month. Therefore, there's a more sort of homogeneous wreck. Is this caused because there's more traffic becomes more homogeneous, or because the summer months become more dangerous? Obviously, it is the fact that traffic is becoming more common throughout the year. Then we need to do, obviously, to know something about traffic volumes, because if we have a few more wrecks in somewhere, it could be caused by more traffic and not something becoming more dangerous. Actually, it could become less dangerous, obviously, if there were far more boats traveling there. So we created a traffic volume proxy based on two things. The first one based on ports ins and outs. So we know how many ships arrived in the port and how many ships departed a given port. And we extracted data for the 12 major ports in the UK for the period 1860 to 1850. But also we created a model of traffic density. So the likelihood of a vessel for crossing any given cell in our data set based on route modeling. So we created, I can't go into this is another paper, routes, so calculated this cost path between all the ports in our data set. Then we created the density calculation for each one of the cells. And then we have a cost surface that gives us a likelihood of a ship transiting that cell at any given point. When we have this, then we can determine the likelihood of a ship to wreck on a journey from one port to another. Therefore, we have a port wrecking likelihood that we can then find for people. So if we have the ships in and the ships out in the case of London, we know the number of wrecks of the ships that wreck going into London, number of the ships that wreck leaving London, and then we can have a look at the wrecking likelihood for each one of those ports over time. Now, what we want to do is to combine everything. So how do we do that? Well, the first thing to do is, as I said, aggregate this on cells that we can work with. The second thing is, this is what I'm going to show you today in terms of results, is say, okay, just let's take a distance, an arbitrary distance, and we work with different thresholds, and we can determine whether any cell was within that distance of a light. And then we can look at the wrecks within those cells, therefore at a given distance of a light. So that's the result sheet. But in the future, what we'll do now is get for every light and for every cell and for every year, whether that cell was lit or not lit, and also with every characteristic. Was it lit by that type of lamp, by the parabolic reflector? Was it already a Fresnel lens? Was it one kind of fuel, one kind of wicks? Is it a multiple concentric wick? So we'll have exactly the power, we'll know all those details, and we can cross it with environmental variables. So we know the depth of the seabed, we know the likelihood of fog. We can use all those parameters afterward to do regressions based on each one of those cells. Okay, so what does it look like if we look at the very simple model? So taking, in that case, Dan took 290 cells and try to look at what's happening after an event, so after the introduction of a light around a radius of 10 miles. We also work with 2.5, 7.5, and 15, and the results are relatively the same. So this is what we have. So what Dan did is, based on this event study methodology, is look at what's happening when we have the introduction of light. So here we have the introduction of light, so the event is here in -1, and we have 10 years before the event, and we have then 15 years after. Well, what you notice is that when you have so the first thing is that when there is an increase in the likelihood of wrecks, or the number of wrecks, that leads to the construction. So there seems to be an endogenous factor here. People want lighthouse because there are lots of wrecks. That seems to make sense. The second thing, there seems to be a short-term decrease after a short-term effect after introduction house, but then something reverting back to trend. I am not sure whether this shows a real effect or whether this is caused by a displacement. It could be that, you know, when you have a light, the route becomes safer and more, the mariner says, okay, now we have a light, this is a safer route, so let's take that route. And therefore, the fact that it's back to trend might mean actually that that is safer, but obviously because we have more vessels. So that is something we don't know yet. But there seems at least one clear conclusion is that there seems to be an endogeneity, which means that we could test then that later by looking at a data set from newspapers, looking at for each lighthouse when it was introduced, if we can find typical public outcry or outrage for losses that happen in the vicinity, or we could try to see if we can model this at a larger scale. So, okay, well, that's exactly what I'm saying. So what do we want next? Well, what we want to do next is obviously use the full data to do econometric testing on this. We want to go further than just having the light, but testing the impact of different technologies, because these are fundamental, both for the lighting in terms of the emission of light, so the lamp itself, but also the type of optical apparatus. We want to create a finer proxy for regional coastal traffic beyond the 12 ports we have. We want to look at different distance thresholds and for different light types. And we also want to test for historical weather events. There's sometimes you can have lots of wrecks, obviously caused by one major storm that could engulf, that could be happening across the UK and therefore create many wrecks. And potentially match light constructions to public outcry using a newspaper database. And obviously, if you have any other suggestions of things we could do with the data and how we could analyze this data in terms of privacy, we'd be very happy to hear about this. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much for this very exciting presentation. I think it's no exaggeration to say that this is a fantastic data set you have here. So the sort of comments or questions I have is sort of more, what can we now do with this fantastic data? And clearly the main challenge here in order to get at this question about productivity and safety is to find some exogenous variation in where these lighthouses came up and when they came up. And as you alluded to in that event study you have, it looks like there was some indigeneity in that. So here's a couple of questions on how one might get there. So one would be to sort of think about the other question that you have in the background here, which is the speed, getting from A to B, where the indigeneity, I think, is less problematic. So that might be one way of going with this, because you're not building a lighthouse because of the speed. Presumably, it's more likely you build it right there because a lot of ships are wrecking in that particular place. So that might be sort of one way of making some headway on this. Another question is, are there any geographical features that can predict where you're going to put a lighthouse? So if you have a coastline, you've got to put a lighthouse somewhere there, which is going to light up a certain grid. Where are you going to put it? And I would sort of just my limited understanding of lighthouses, I would have thought you put it on the hill, right, on the top, which would then mean that there's a reason why it's right there and not sort of a bit further down the line. So maybe it's possible to get some exogenous variation out of that, where you're comparing to the nearby grid cells to based on a prediction from the geography. And final question is about the time frame. So you're using years as the unit of analysis here, so grid cell year. I wonder if that is the best way of going about it. And you probably thought about this already, but one could imagine making the time sort of interval smaller, looking at sort of the winter months, for example, where there's more risky, or go the other way and say, let's do a long run regression here, where we are looking at the sort of the long run effect of these lighthouses, not over the next year, but over the next sort of average over the next 20 years or something like that. And that way trying to get at this in a more different setting.
Cool, thank you, Toki. For the first question, which is about what can we do with this? I mean, this is only one part, obviously, of the project. So speed is definitely another element, but also other. So I didn't present here at all today, but we are building the same data set for France, which we called. So this is LAN, and the French one is FLAN, and the idea is obviously to compare and contrast the two. Why? Because the French system is also fundamentally different in the sense that it is a system built from its inception by a country that underwent a revolution and have very centralized institutions, and establish a commission led by the best scientists of its time and say, wait a minute, the British have already developed some lighthouse, how can we do it? And they put all the scientists in a room and say, what's the best way? And rather than having lighthouse popping up here and there, they establish a general plan of where to put the lighthouse in the best possible way. And then the British say, oh, the French have done so much better. And they try to do like the French. So there's a continuous circulation of technology, innovation, this, and so this. So definitely we will get at speed. We'll get at the comparison of the models and their efficiency. We'll get also at the spatial dimension. You mentioned your second question. But if you imagine that you're playing a board game with your kids or something like that, and use one of those where you have to place your unit sets based on a certain number of rules, we could create a model where we say, okay, what is the answer to the equation of maximizing this and comparing to what actually happened? That actually is possible based on we'll have to think carefully about what are the parameters we want. One is obviously people know where there are more ships. You wouldn't, even if it makes sense to put it on that hill, if that hill is in the middle of, the North Sea or in far north Scotland, perhaps that's not the best investment. Then there's the cost of building light. So all those parameters, we haven't really defined what is the maximization equation will look like, but that's something we could do and compare it to the next one. In terms of productivity, it's I think obviously is the key question, and I think what is tricky is that precisely brings in the question of the reality of the shipping. And so one thing we could do for some light sources is turn them on and turn them off and say, okay, when we turn them on, if we use, for example, a routing model, by how much longer would be the route without the lighthouse, or how much shorter the route is, therefore how much time is won by this. Whether there's endogeneity or not, I fear there might be actually, Toki, because some people would build a lighthouse to make a certain route available to mariners, especially when it was known to be very dangerous, and therefore they get sometimes. That obviously we probably not many of them, so we could distinguish that. But so I think in terms of finally the time span, when Dan was mentioning this, I was really worried because I told him, are you sure you can do econometric with something there's one event every 15 years in a cell or something like that, because it's very infrequent, fortunately, wrecks. I mean, there are places I didn't show you the hotspot analysis. I mean, obviously some places are very dangerous, but like most cells have very few events. So if I would restrict to even to the months one, I don't know how it works in terms of econometrics, but that's extraordinarily infrequent events. In terms, I mean, the natural thing to do, and the first analysis we did is we take the 10 years before, the 10 years after, or the 20 years before, 20 years after, and compare all this. That's, for me, was like the most sort of intuitive attitude to this. But obviously, the longer you go, the more likely you have to have changes in the shipping itself. And capturing this is extraordinarily difficult because a ship leaves London and going to Bristol, but in between. So it's when you go at the level of the cell, it's not like we can chart, and for coastal, we don't even know where, the in and out of each ship. So we have numbers for different ports, but it's become, so I think we'll risk another thing in there, which is how do we have that proxy for the volume, for the traffic when we extend this? Whereas a few years, it's very likely to think that, there's not, the displacement cannot be that, immediate. So I think that I could see as probably potentially the problem with adopting a longer time span for the events that we want to study. I'm not sure if I've forgotten one of your questions. But I think
you're very comprehensive there. I think we have lots of questions here. So let's start over with Petro there.
I have a suggestion, just thinking about how to maybe help get rid of endogeneity, right? And it reminds me of those papers when people were looking at the benefits of seatbelts, because if the seatbelt saves your life, you might drive faster and so on. So in your case, after the lighthouses were built, do you have the records when they were shut down for maintenance? For example, maybe they have the records when they turn it off, right? And then here you need the exogenous shock in the sense that you're going to turn off the lighthouse. And would shipping companies or captains know that the lighthouse would be shut down in advance? And if they don't, we would expect what? A higher likelihood of accidents and shipwrecks, because they would just be flying or sailing blindly without knowing what was happening. If they know in advance, then this would kill down my idea. So maybe another suggestion might also be related to, for example, wars, right? There might be a change in the routes if, say, the channel between France and the UK was forbidden for traffic. Or finally, you can also look at shocks to budgets. Imagine, I don't know, for some reason there is a war and they have to lower the maintenance, right? So we would be able to compare the same lighthouses, but with slightly poor productivity, and then you can try to find the causal effect. That's it.
Sorry. Yeah, I mean, I think the shock, I mean, looking at something that looks some kind of exogenous shock would be the obvious thing. I'm not sure. I mean, your suggestions sound great, but I'm not sure they actually work for this data. So if we think about the maintenance one, I mean, when there was maintenance, so lighthouses were actually down quite a lot, but not because they were supposed to, but because the guy who was doing it was not doing his job properly, and he was fine. So we know of maintenance, but they are short term, obviously. And they often come up, for example, there's a parliamentary inquiry in 1961 when people say, "I've seen that this light wire was down, and that created a wreck there," or something like that. But it's because it's certainly not like a planned maintenance in the sense like this light is going to be out for 6 months now. So yeah, but the problem is that if we have one event one day we is out and we have nothing happening that day, I mean, can we use that? I mean, it's so, it's very, very infrequent, and with even more infrequent events. I mean, and then the second point is what was the second suggestion? The wars. Oh yeah, the wars. So for the wars, I've tried to think about this. There's a great data set. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, Clywalk, which is, all basically there were ship logs. So basically mariners taking every day their position and writing where they were. That's for big or transoceanic shipping, or for the big, the East India Company, the Dutch and the French, or even the Navy. So these ships have, good record of where they were at different points. So we can trace the exact path of it. So although they're not like doing some coastal shipping or the shipping, like the commercial shipping we're mostly interested in, we could see the points where they were. And we could see this for like, they have a long record of that. So we could trace them in war years and not war years and try to see the impact of that. But this is also a type of shipping and of like sailing that doesn't rely as much on lighthouses as the coastal navigation, which is much less sort of skilled navigation. They, the sailors would think that this is like, for trainees, and this way, where they don't use sex and they don't have as much equipment. And certainly it requires a much more of a visual direction. So seeing the light is a very important thing, or seeing the coast, perhaps. So that might be difficult. And otherwise we know nothing. I mean, we have no way of having points. Yeah, sorry.
Let's just get 2 quick questions.
I recall Cose's point is that a lot of these lighthouses were built by private capital, not by the state.
Yeah.
How did the private capitalists monetize their investment in the lighthouse? And is there any basis for judging where it was private, where it was state, based on factors that you've got in your data set?
So, I mean, light dues is the answer. So they collected in the ports. I mean, obviously they didn't collect them individually. So in the port, when a ship arrived, they had passed X amount of lights. Therefore, like you do on a motorway, we're supposed to pay the dues for this. But obviously, because it's a private investment, means there's definitely an infrastructure for only just for collecting that due. That's the first point. So the debate between private and public is something that is really looking at the detail of those financial and contractual arrangement, but then obviously the technical aspect too. So, for example, the French system was supposed to be the public one, as some private investments. So Caudron, the most famous lighthouse in France, is fundamentally a private investment until really late. And then, once you have like new technology coming in, this is something we want to look at, is how is new technology, let's say the Fresnel lens, spread in a system that is supposed to be a private market one versus one where the state says, okay, every lighthouse now has this new lens. So I think in fact, that it's not just a dichotomy between private and public. There are like lots of difference when we look at all these aspects.
Let's just take one last question and a very quick answer so we can get a couple of questions.
Great. So I've just got 2 questions. One is, could you possibly evaluate similar geographies where one has a lighthouse, the other one doesn't? And given the quality of your data, it looks like you've got relatively detailed longitude, latitude data on these cells, so that you could actually find some sort of nearest neighbor type matching between, say, parts of Britain that look a lot like parts of Spain or parts of France, so that you can compare one geography equipped with a lighthouse with one that isn't, where everything else, the depth, the geographic features are otherwise the same. Might that be a possibility? And the other thing was, it used to be a thing that people set up fake lighthouses to cause deliberate crashes, which gives you a crash probability of almost 100%. So at least relative to that baseline, you should be able to estimate crash probability, fake lighthouse versus a real one.
Yeah, and there are lots of things on legend about for that. And there's a book by David Cressy, is just out now, Oxford University Press, looking at the economy of wrecking and precisely how people were benefiting from this. Again, attested, occurrences that are so few that in the documented one, I'm not sure. I mean, we could look into this. I'm not sure how it works for the exact location and sort of. Potentially, yes, but what's transiting is so different. Even if I found a place which is like environmentally the same, using current, sea, wave, wind, depth of the sea, tidal move. I mean, even if I were able to put all of this and say, okay, cell A and cell B are the most similar, and one there might be no traffic whatsoever. So, and then if I, perhaps I misunderstand this, but I'm not sure how. Then how would I, get to the sort of the comparison between one that is lit and not lit? Yeah, sure. Come up with pairs. But including traffic, so say like there's lots of traffic in those two cells and everything is similar, but one is lit, one is not lit.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's something I also had in mind you might do. But let's close it on this. We got a really good discussion here.